Okay, so I will move along and introduce our guests from IBM. I will start with Chris McCurdy. Chris, this is Chris. He is currently the Vice President for Security Services. Then we have Chris Jones, Dallas Solutions Representative, right over here. And then we have Michael Monticello. Monticello, there we go. Michael is, let's see, he has more than 10 years of experience in information security, during which,
Yep.
There we go.
There we go.
During which he has served as Senior Threat and Intelligence Researcher on the Managed Security Services Intelligence team. And he's been a Vulnerability Management Coordinator and Forensic Investigator for state governments, as well as Principal Security Analyst for an industry analysis firm. As the Threat Research and Intelligence Principal with IBM Security Services, he conducts research on emerging threat trends and works to ensure that client security needs are met with their standard offerings. So pay very close attention to what he says and ask lots of good questions afterwards. Give the floor to him.
So one thing they didn't mention in my bio there was I quite literally just got off of a 26,000 foot mountain. So this whole week I've been telling people that if I say something dumb, bear in mind that my brain's been operating with less oxygen than yours for a while. But that said, I kind of always hate hearing my background. It's kind of tough to sit through. And I always tell people that the most important thing to recognize with my background is that when I was a young man, I learned how to do this. And IBM disclosure, if you're not familiar with what this is actually a Facebook poster. It was something that they gave me. I hacked Facebook a number of years ago, and I couldn't take the bug bounty, so they gave me these posters, which I would have rather had the $500, but I guess it works in a slide, right? But when I was a young man, I learned how to do this, which promptly got me that by my parents. Side note, and I always have to give this disclaimer, if you think this is funny and you want to replicate these slides, just ask me for the slides as opposed to using this, because I Googled cartoon spanking at work to get this slide. And that's an interesting conversation with your management, to be perfectly honest with you. So yeah, just a little disclaimer there. But it's good that, my parents did that, because, if I would have gotten in trouble for those types of things, I wouldn't have been able to work for these guys. And, I like to tell people that this is the persona that I bring to IBM, but realistically what they like to push out is more something that's aligned with this, right? Where, something a little more presentable. By the way, I put this in there for you guys to laugh because I think that's hilarious. Yeah. So actually where this came from is before I went on the Today Show, they said, we need to see a professional photo so we know what we're going to be working with. And as I mentioned, I'm a mountain climber, so I'd not shaved in a couple of weeks because I was up in the mountains. So I shaved that hideous looking stash and called my best friend who's a photographer and sent them the picture on the left there. And they sent back that they're going to need me to send a different professional photo. But go figure, I thought I looked great. But anyways, in joining IBM, I really joined and really became a part of a team, and it was really a career goal for me for a number of years. Having worked in government, I worked with a lot of the IBM researchers, and particularly the researchers on this team, the X-Force, which if you're not familiar with us, I don't have enough time to go through everything that we do. But one of the more brilliant things that IBM has ever done is recognize that research in the security space really happens in two different manners. There's the typical research you're probably familiar with IBM. That's research that's 3 to 5 years out. Things like Watson or Deep Blue, or mathematical research that aren't necessarily applicable that particular day, but are a couple of years out and they could really change things. But what they recognize with security is that doesn't make sense for security. Security is moving so quickly and so rapidly that we really had to have a research team that was more closely tied to operations. And that's really what the X-Force is. You know, doing things like vulnerability research, malware analysis, zero-day vulnerability research, IP reputation, all that fun stuff. What we put together is an environment where we have over 15 billion events per day that we're monitoring and analyzing. We have the world's largest and most complete vulnerability database with over 95,000 documented vulnerabilities. We've maintained that since 1997. I say we, but in reality, I was in middle school in 1997, so I really had nothing to do with that. And there's college kids in the room, so I don't feel young in saying that, sadly. You know, we monitor in over 133 different countries. And one thing to mention on the vulnerability database too, if you really follow this environment and find that valuable, a lot of the work on OSVDB has been discontinued because of a lack of support. So, you know, really something that you need to take a look at. And if you're trying to use OSVDB still, you really need to transition over and take a look at ours. So all that said, you know, when we look at security, I think this quote from Bill Gates is great, and it's old. And it really came, I was actually with Katie Mazuris this week, briefing some of the folks in the Department of Defense, which if you're not familiar with Katie, she used to run security at Microsoft. And what was interesting was that she always tells these stories about how, you know, in the early days of the worms and, you know, kind of the worm apocalypse, as she calls it, we really were running into solely single source issues with Microsoft. And so there would to be a lot of pressure on Microsoft to start doing better security. And they had no intention of doing it. And she'll flatly tell you they had no intention of doing it until the DoD started saying, we're not going to use Microsoft computers anymore. We're only going to use Linux and Unix and different types because your security is so terrible. And so you got these great quotes from Bill Gates who transitioned their entire methodology, and you saw things like trusted computing come out, which started in the marketing group, little known fact. But I think it's a great quote because what it highlights is what security really is. So he said security is, I would say, our top priority because for all the exciting things you'll be able to do with computers, if we don't solve these security problems, then people will hold back. And the analogy that we use all the time is the car and the brakes. You know, why do you put brakes on a car? You didn't put brakes on a car to stop. You put brakes on a car so you could let the car go faster. And you know, the other aspect that we use for analogies is we often talk about the fact that nowadays you see security tacked on a lot after the fact. So a project comes out, it's a new and innovative project, and then somebody says, wait a minute, we might have a security issue here, and then they start tacking on security. The other aspect with cars is that when you purchase a car, you don't drive off the lot and say, you know, we should probably put brakes on this thing, right? And so, you know, I think this really was a very succinct way of explaining some of those things. What we're doing with security is we're trying to enable our businesses to move faster and tackle the challenges that they set out to. Now, if you go back a number of years and you really look at the past, you know, security has not been a top priority for really a very long time. And I say really a very long time because 1981 was my birth year and I am not that old. But if you go back to 1981, there were very few viruses out there. And in fact, like Elk Cloner was one of the nastier ones. And you're literally looking at everything that Elk Cloner did. All it did is put this stuff on a disk. And you know, when we saw computers getting more connected, we saw networking, we even saw broadcasts, you saw, you know, different types of intrusions happening. Like when Captain Midnight hacked into the HBO broadcast and put up one of the earlier hacktivism messages of, you know, HBO is too expensive at $12.95 a month. Are you crazy? Clearly, he had no idea how much quality programming was going to be coming through on HBO. I mean, $12.95 a month for Silicon Valley and Game of Thrones is nothing. Which, you know, but this kind of highlights some of the earlier things that we actually ran into. You know, pretty simplistic stuff. And so in the early days, at the inception of security, it really made sense that antivirus and firewalls were our two core technologies. You look at something like antivirus, and it's such an interesting environment to me, both as a technologist and as an industry analyst. Looking at antivirus and the way that that technology came about, it was so reactive. It was meant to find the 10 viruses that were available in the 80s, and now we use it as kind of a preventative technology. But if you go back and you look at that environment at the early inception of security, it made sense to have antivirus and firewall. But then, you look at that and you look at some of the years that this model has persisted, and it's been around for a really long time. And yes, you are in fact reading that right. We still run into antivirus and firewall as the security technologies, the core security technologies that environments run. Now, granted, if you're in this room, you probably recognize that that's not the case for what you need anymore, but we really do run into this, especially in small to medium businesses where they don't have any security technology other than their antivirus and firewalls. And a good question is, well, what do you guys run at home? And unless you're an open source lover or you've really invested in a more expensive router, most people at home are still running antivirus and firewalls. And the scary thing about that is where we see that translating over, where we see that translating over into businesses, or we see that translating over into CIOs or CEOs, executive level, boardroom level people. Their understanding of security is still, well, what do we do with the firewall, and why isn't our antivirus stopping this? Now, if you take a look at how businesses have recognized that security has changed, we've recognized the threat has really changed. Most of the people in this room recognize that the threat is not what we used to see. Things like gangs, like the Masters of Deception, who are somewhat famous for hacking into the AT&T network in the early 90s, and really moving on to guys like Kevin Mitnick, and then seeing really hacktivist groups in circa 2010, 2011, like LulzSec or Anonymous. And really moving forward where you start to see things like insider threats that can cause huge disruptions. Or you even see entire industries with cyber criminals and infrastructure popping up where these criminals have the opportunity to monetize their attacks, monetize the data that they've taken, and turn it into a business environment. And then, probably the most challenging to fend off are the constant attackers, the state-sponsored attackers who, are highly educated, and their entire life is based off of hacking into singular targets in a lot of cases. We've recognized that a lot of this environment has changed. And so it's pretty easy to recognize that the threat to our computer security is far more hostile, it's far more sophisticated, it's more organized. It's just more challenging for us to deal with than needing to have solely antivirus and firewalls. And if you take a look at where we're seeing some of the attacks happening, one of the things that's become very apparent is that we're not necessarily dealing with the sole attacker anymore. You take a look at 2014, and the reason why we have this is that you'll see that Zeus was one of the primary utilities used to attack in 2014. If you're not familiar with Zeus, it's a fairly advanced piece of malware. The source code got leaked out on the internet back in 2014, and a ton of people were adopting it and utilizing it to make money off of their attacks. And what you saw from 2014 where there were folks that didn't necessarily have the capabilities for additional research, additional development, or frankly fixing bugs in the malware code that they were using. Now we've shifted over to this environment in 2015 where Zeus is used much less, and proprietary pieces of malware are being used to attack organizations. And these pieces of malware are coming from organized criminal groups that in certain cases we've done tracking, we've seen some of them are doing over $60 million in revenue. Now this is a $14 billion market. Well, it's not even a market anymore, it's an industry. And when you're talking about that much funding in that type of environment, you're talking about advances in technologies, advances in capabilities. Frankly, we see a faster adoption of encryption technology in a lot of the malware spaces than we really see anywhere else. The first time I ever saw an MD6 hash was in a piece of malware, and that was almost 10 years ago. So, and how many of us are still trying to shift off of MD5 and SHA hashes? I mean, it's a really difficult environment to contend with. And so if you look at how this has evolved, back in 2011, we called it the year of the security breach. Now, a couple of things, and I've had this slide for, 5 years now, and there are two things that I always point out on this slide. They really stick out to me. Number one, some of these environments that were being breached weren't the organizations that were necessarily lackluster about security. A lot of these organizations had a pretty good focus on security. RSA is a good example there. And HB Gary is a great example. You tend to have these alumni groups, and obviously here at ISSA where you are all gathering, everybody kind of knows each other in security after a certain point. We're very well connected. And one of the best alumni groups in security is the NSA Summer Intern Program from the early 2000s, late 90s. And I happen to know that several of them worked over at HB Gary at the time of their hack. So what that pointed out to me is that it's not necessarily just about how well you apply security within a silo. It's about how comprehensively you apply it throughout your entire organization. And I should give you an idea of what you're looking at with these bubbles in this chart. The size of the bubble indicates our best guess at monetary impact. Sony, oops, this is not the right button. Sony, oh, I'm terrible with a lightsaber. Sony on the slide is a pretty good key there because they publicly stated they were going to lose $171 million as a result of their breach. The other thing that sticks out to me is that in a lot of cases, these are breach vectors that we'd known about for a long period of time. Things like SQL injection. SQL injection was discovered back in 1996. It didn't get definitively labeled and have a definitive paper written about it until 2003. But by 2011, we knew how to find it in development. We knew how to block it in production. We knew how to fix this issue. But it was still one of the major arenas with which organizations were being breached. Now, going back to that comprehensive application of security, Sony is another good example of that, where if you ever went to Sony's website in 2011, they had all the best practices in place on their e-commerce website. The problem was that they weren't breached over their e-commerce website. They were breached over a web application that was buried on an Apache server that they've long since forgotten about, wasn't managed, wasn't monitored, wasn't in their asset inventory, and yet it cost them $171 million. Now, interesting thing about 2011, the reason why I keep using this slide, is in 2011, we looked at this and we said, that's going to be the year of the security breach. This is what we're going to call this. Because any of us that have worked government or worked law enforcement, you kind of know that it takes like 6 to 8 months to put a case together. And the attacks that people were doing in 2011 were egregious. And we were just saying, okay, you guys are all going to get arrested. Kind of have this happen, only it's not going to be your parents. It's going to be law enforcement that does it to you. And so, yeah, we called it the year of the security breach because we thought we would never see a breach environment that was that bad. But with that in mind, if 2011 was the year of the security breach, then the question that we always have to ask is, what do you call 2012, 13, 14, and 15? And if you're looking at this, we've just seen this massive flood of breaches. And increasingly, we're seeing more and more breaches. And in fact, in 2015, there were 274 major breaches. Right? We are in an environment where breaches are happening all over the place. Sir?
How do you define major?
Well, so major, we kind of gave it it's a kind of a thumb in the wind. I mean, it's not necessarily it's not what we reported. It was just what I put on the slide. But essentially, what I call major is based on the number of records that they lose and the amount of money that they lose, where it's significant enough where it just doesn't look like a pixel on the map. But essentially, the environment that we're looking at, there are enough breaches where a lot of people, when they think about breaches, they think about credit card information. And it's kind of a similar thing for folks that look at antivirus and firewall, where it's what they're familiar with because you probably received a notification in the mail. But the reality of this market is that there are so many breached credit cards out there on the black market that attackers aren't necessarily going after them in a lot of cases because the market's too saturated to sell the credit cards. I've been out there, I've found coupons, I found discounts. I found a BOGO deal once, you know, the buy one, get one free for credit cards, right? I thought that was only for shoes, right? But, you know, that's the reality of this breach environment. And we're seeing it all over the map. You know, we're seeing it in every country. Canada's had issues, France has had issues, Turkey's had issues. And frankly, with breach notification laws, we're expecting to see, as those advance in different geographies in the world, we're expecting to see more breaches being put out there into the public space where we can actually track that. Sir? So this is talking about breaching an infrastructure and being able to get data. A skimmer wouldn't necessarily be considered a breach because it's not actually breaching any type of infrastructure application that's owned by a business. Well, Target was a breach because they hacked into the HVAC systems and then through a 10-step process ended up being able to get to an administrative server that actually had access to their point of sales solutions. That was interesting. But had access to their point of sale solutions where they could essentially put a piece of malware on their POSs. So it wasn't like a physical skimmer that you would put over an ATM, for example. It was more of a logical side, I guess, is how you would define that. But I mean, skimmers are a huge problem, and we're actually seeing advances in skimming technology as well, where they're right. Right, and you know, the reality is that in a lot of those cases, the ATM network, because it's such a crucial network and because it's such a specified technology, is oftentimes you're not seeing that updated to the newest applications. So a lot of ATMs actually still run Windows 95, for example. So, which that was a fun. I was actually at an ATM getting money out, and it froze for a second, and so I just started jamming keys to see what would happen, and it rebooted into Windows 95, and it was kind of like not using that one, you know. And we've seen where they're turning entire ATMs into skimmers, and that's kind of a more recent thing. But no, those don't get counted in our breaches. Now, if somebody went and breached the entire network and stole a couple of $1 million, which we actually saw in Canada a number of years ago, then yeah, we count those in our numbers. So. And folks, feel free to shout out questions. Just raise a hand. I'm happy to answer them as I'm talking. Ma'am. Absolutely. This is actually an interactive website that we have. And you can go on there and you can check a whole bunch of boxes. You can narrow it down to specific industries. You can take it out into specific geographies or a specific attack vector, for example. Yeah. Yeah. So just anybody who talks to me, I'm going to make you talk to sales too, right? No, I'm just joking. But you know, when we talk about these breaches, these things are not cheap for businesses. On average, here in the United States, a breach costs $6.5 million, and that's in 2015. So these things are really expensive for businesses. Now, I would say so, yes. And you know, this number is actually very difficult to calculate because what I'm not taking into account is what's your damage to your brand, right? Because that's an invaluable asset. Your ethos, I can't calculate that in a tangible number, right? And so most businesses, if you talk to a senior level executive, they can't tell you exactly how much it costs them. They can tell you how much it costs them from an operational perspective, but how much does it cost you in terms of loss of business? That's a little more difficult to calculate. Now, the average cost per record compromised was $154 here in the United States. And the average total cost globally, and you'll notice that this is much lower than the US, was $3.79 million. Now, what this accounts to is about a 23% increase in terms of the total amount of how much this has gone up year to year. And that's actually over 2 years, but you get the idea that this cost is actually going up for businesses. Now that cost of $154 per record, that's an average cost. It's actually more expensive based on the particular type of data. So if you lose medical records, for example, it can be a lot more expensive than that. Whereas government data actually tends to be worth a little bit less. Now, medical records is really interesting because it's one of the primary areas that's being targeted currently. Medical records, there's a lot that goes into that. Number one, a lot of those records, once you uncork that bottle, you can't recork that. You know, if you lose your social security number, it's incredibly difficult to get that information back, or change your social security number, rather, I should say. And we see this all the time. In fact, one of our researchers actually had his medical identity stolen, and he actually had to go down to a hospital and had to lift up his shirt and show them that he still had his appendix in his body to prove that he didn't owe them $35,000 for having his appendix removed. And so, you know, this type of thing is happening all the time, and it's occurring in a lot of different areas. Now, if you take a look at the breach clause globally, the United States is number one. Part of that is that we have the most mature rules, regulations, and laws in place. Germany is number two in a lot of those spaces, and very similarly has a lot of rules, laws, and regulations. We expect to actually see the Netherlands creeping up in this list because they have a number of pieces that are being legislated and have gone into effect where they actually have to do notifications of breaches as well. So we expect to see that kind of come more into the picture as well, because it's easier to track that information once the laws go in place. Now, if you take a look at some of the vulnerabilities that are being exploited to actually breach these organizations, interestingly enough, 2015, we saw more vulnerabilities disclosed than we'd ever seen before. Now, what's interesting about that is that we're actually seeing less vulnerabilities being disclosed versus released on the black market. Now, the question that we always have is, what's the point of disclosing a vulnerability when you could sell it on the black market for a couple $100,000? An Android vulnerability, a good one, like the master key vulnerability, which was found by the same guy who found SQL injection, I know for a fact that he was offered $600,000 for that vulnerability. Right? This is there's a big market out there. You know, PDF and Adobe vulnerabilities go for like $3,000 even, and these are easy vulnerabilities to find. You'll notice that 2014 we actually saw more vulnerabilities, but what happened is we actually had to reduce that number because there were a number of Android applications that had an SSL vulnerability that were later all condensed down into a single CVE. So we only counted that as one instead of 4,000. So that's why we say 2015 we saw more than we've ever seen before. I'll cover a little bit about mobile applications and mobile security. Obviously, we're flying through this information, so can't cover all of it, but I'll touch on that and why we see some of those things in a little bit. But you know, one thing I really want to stress to you, and if you're not aware of this, if there's one thing that you should remember about this today, is that there are entire markets out there for stealing data and monetizing data. This is what the reality of the business that we're in, is that there's another business that their competition is being able to break into our businesses and steal data so that they can make money off of it. And they're making a lot of money today. It's larger than the drug trade, right? It's a $14 billion environment. And you can go out there, you can purchase credit cards, you can purchase generally just about anything that you want. A couple of things to note here. Number one, these prices are all very high. They are actually a lot lower today. I wouldn't spend more than $5 on a credit card if you're in the market for purchasing one, which I hope that you're not. But the other thing to point out too is that there's a lot of advanced stuff on here. Like for example, they include the zip codes and areas that these credit cards are in, so that if you wanted to actually replicate a credit card and actually have a magnetic stripe where you swipe it, that the fraud detection for banks won't pick it up as easily, right? Because if a credit card gets swiped in Barcelona, Spain, and it gets swiped in Dallas, Texas within 5 minutes of each other, pretty easy to figure out, I think there's something wrong there. But if it gets swiped in Dallas, Texas, and then gets swiped again later in Dallas, Texas, a lot more difficult to actually catch that issue. And if you actually look at the market and how these credit cards are stolen, When I first started, and I started out as a forensic investigator, the way that it worked is you had a hacker, you'd choose a target, he would write an exploit, he would steal the data, he would post that he had stolen data to a forum, he would sell a whole data dump to a carder. The carder would then announce card availability, and in that sale, I should say, he would have to go to a money launderer, and then once they got the money to the carder would then sell the cards individually to an individual buyer who would again have to go through a money launderer. And at the end of the day, the buyer would get their credit card. Kind of a complex process. There's a lot of people here. There's a lot of places for law enforcement to interject itself. This model actually comes from a major bust from the Secret Service back in 2004, I want to say. It was the biggest bust of its time, and it was a group called the Shadow Crew. One of the people from the Shadow Crew turned informant. His last name was Rodriguez, and if that sounds familiar, it's because he later hacked TJX and stole 22 million credit cards, which at that time was the largest credit card theft in computer history. Sir? Are you saying now you don't have this? Well, that is correct, sir, and if you take a look at what we have today, the way that it works today is far more simple, right? You have some person, they choose their target, they purchase their exploit, they steal the data, they post it to the darknet, somebody buys it with Bitcoin, and your credit card's gone. It's that simple. It's a lot harder for law enforcement to interject itself here. It's a lot harder to detect that there's an issue, and it's a very optimized market. There's an infrastructure for being able to, put this data out there and make money off of it. Yeah, but those firewall vendors aren't a managed service from IBM. Talk to my salesperson here up at the front of the room, sir. But you're right. A lot of these things come with 24/7 English, and typically we see Russian-speaking support. For anybody who is in the room and вы говорите по-русски, that would be really helpful. Sorry? Я говорю немного. Which actually is a really common thing for anybody doing malware research. There are a lot of people that can speak Russian. Go figure, right? But much of this information, much of these products that have support, as you mentioned, can be found out there on the darknet. And if you're not familiar with the darknet, it's worthwhile to actually sit through a whole presentation on it. But the 30-second overview of it is that you have your surface internet, which is anything that you can find with Google or Bing. And if you can find something with Bing, congratulations. But then you have the invisible web, which is anything that's not out there on the search engine that can be crawled. So anything really that has a robots.txt or is hidden behind an authentication page. And that's kind of your darknet. And below that, you have what's called the deep web. And this is really only accessible through an anonymized network like Tor or I2P. And essentially, you can go out there and it's this anonymous network with anonymous web pages that nobody knows who runs it, but you can purchase all kinds of things, like exploits or malware, or you can actually even purchase black hat consultants. And really anything that you could think of. There's murder for hire pages, you can purchase guns, you can go out there and you can actually purchase marijuana on things like the Silk Road. I'm from Colorado, so that's not that big of a deal to me. We got storefronts for that. Texas, but you can really purchase anything you want. And if we're talking about the breach space, you can actually go on and you can purchase somebody to actually hack this stuff for you. So it's hiring a pretty high-priced consultant to help you break into an organization. Now the reason why I point this out is because the environment's not like what it was when I started in an industry where I had to be, pretty technical and really know what I was doing to be able to hack into organizations. Today, you don't need that. You just need to know where to go to actually hire these people. And they make search engines for this stuff, so it's pretty easy to find. So when we come down to, the security capabilities, the thing that's so clear is that this idea of firewall and antivirus, it's just flatly not enough anymore. And what's happened is it's become a piece of the puzzle for what's actually necessary for blocking some of these attacks. You have to have things like intrusion prevention systems, identity and access management. You also have to have content filtering, and then data loss prevention, and web application firewalls. And at the end of the day, there's just a ton of different technologies that you actually have to employ to be able to protect all the different vectors with which these organizations, with these people, can actually break into things. And as I was kind of talking with the table here earlier, that a lot of these technologies actually have underlying technology that you have to be aware of. And there's just so much information. There's so many different tools, technologies, processes, procedures that you have to be aware of, that it in and of itself has really become a really challenging environment for a lot of us in security, where we have just so many pointed technologies trying to address one issue that at the end of the day, we're running into environments like this, where enterprises are oftentimes running 85 different tools from 45 different vendors. And on top of that, we have a skills shortage, right? Where 83% of enterprises are having difficulty finding people. So you have a hostile threat environment, you have a difficult to manage technology environment, and then you're short on people to run all of these things, right? And so we're really operating today in a space where it's ripe for attackers to create breaches. And some of the statistics, that are coming out of this stuff, where at a top level, 61% of organizations say that data theft and cybercrime are their greatest threats to their reputation, to their brand, to their business. And you're seeing 70% of security executives having cloud and mobile security concerns, while at the same time that environment is frankly becoming a playground in a lot of cases. Not so much at the operating system layer, but more at the application layer. And then you see, the statistics that I mentioned, where we have an environment where this is incredibly difficult to contend with. Much of these come from reports that I'd be happy to get you. Just to touch on the mobile space, because I think it's important to recognize, mobile it's a really interesting environment, because what we're doing as we're adopting this technology is we're making a lot of the same mistakes as we've made in the past. One of the things that I was talking about earlier, one of my favorite things is looking at airlines, because I'm on planes so much. I just want to make sure that I have a way of making the system work for me. And a lot of cases, even the airlines are not applying the same security technology that they have in their web applications to their mobile devices. There was an airline mobile app for a long time where instead of sending up the actual authentication to your username, your password to an authentication server, checking it, and then logging you in, they're instead downloading everybody's username and password to your phone and allowing you to do the check on the device itself. Does anybody see a problem with that? But an opportunity to bump people out of first class and put yourself in it, right? And so, we see that in a lot of cases. And frankly, a lot of these applications, anytime you have a developer cutting corners or making mistakes, that's where you start to see vulnerabilities be put in place. The old rule of thumb is that a developer, on average, will program in a vulnerability every 10,000 lines of code. But the reality of it is that a lot of the programmers in the mobile application space are below average. They're hobbyists, they're amateurs that watched a Stanford video and are trying things out. And then on top of that, a lot of these applications are asking for access to things that they shouldn't have. Like, for example, Google Earth wants to access your contacts. Exactly what does Google Earth have to do with your contacts? Or better yet, here's a flashlight that wants access to your location. Why does a flashlight need access to your location? And then you consider some of the information that we're now putting out there, especially utilizing our mobile applications, and we've got some pretty serious trouble where you actually have things like dating information going out there, where some of our studies found that 63% of dating applications actually had issues and vulnerabilities, none of which are our clients, public disclaimer, for a gentleman in the room that I know got screamed at about that. But then you see computer technology creeping into areas that it's never really been before, where things like baby monitors. So a baby monitor in London, Ontario, they actually had creepy music start playing in the middle of the night coming out of their baby monitor. This is a really common story. We also saw, and see this story all the time now, where people are hacking baby monitors and they're screaming at kids through it. And somebody thinks that's funny, right? But then when you start to consider, how scary this is when you start to apply that environment I was talking about with threats and breaches, and the infrastructure to actually optimize this, now you start to see things like this. Entire web applications that you can go on and purchase time to somebody's webcam or their baby monitor or what have you, and just for your entertainment. And we've seen a lot of things like ransomware. We've seen a lot of things like blackmail for having nude images of people, because I don't think about it when I'm changing in front of my computer whether somebody hacked into it. Actually, I think about it all the time, but that's more because I'm paranoid and I'm weird. But the average person doesn't. And so as we're talking about these breaches, as we're talking about technology that's associated with that, we see IoT moving into the enterprise space. And a good example is in automobiles, in transportation. A lot of our organizations use transportation in our heating and cooling systems. And that's going to cause some issues. In a lot of ways, IoT has become a realm kind of like the printer was in the early 2000s, where the printer was always the most vulnerable thing in your organization, because we haven't necessarily applied the security technology around that. So this is really, in my opinion, in a lot of ways, the future of breaches, right? Because we're pulling in applications like mobile applications and IoT technology into our organizations. And in a lot of cases, we're making the same mistakes that we did in the past, where we're not putting security on as we're integrating these capabilities. We're putting it on later. This goes back to that analogy of leaving the auto dealership and then thinking about, I should have put brakes on this car, right? Where it's really going to cause us a lot of problems. And this is a great analogy for this slide, because they could actually turn the brakes off on the car. So now with that in mind, what are the ways that we need to start to think about security? Intelligence has to be the new defense. Understanding how this environment is evolving and being able to integrate that into your capabilities is key. Integration, obviously, the new foundation. As we're looking at all of these different tools and technologies, how are we actually taking those things all together and putting it into a cohesive model? And then finally, expertise is the new focus. Now, in order to create full efficiency through these efforts, it has to be comprehensive across people, process, and technology. And you've probably heard that 100 times. But if you look at some of the different ways, and I won't go through each one of these, but I'll leave you with this slide. There are a number of different things that we really have to take a look at, and really key areas. But these things are always changing in how we have to look at them. Intelligence is just a core capability, and it's so important to be able to integrate this into your security models. Be able to integrate the newest and the latest information. Some of you may have seen IBM's announcement around Watson, which is not necessarily something that we're pushing out there other than the messages. But really what Watson is doing is it's pulling this type of data in, structured and unstructured data. And we're seeing a lot of shifts in models. Most organizations today don't even monitor for what vulnerabilities are new and are out there. That's a reality. Most folks don't know what vulnerabilities were released today. We're releasing 8,000 a year, and most don't know what's released on a daily basis. So, one of the biggest challenges for us in IBM has been, how do we take this environment and, make it useful to others? We're looking at 16 billion events a day and have this massive vulnerability database, have a huge phishing database, have a massive web page and images catalog, which actually we have the second largest index of the internet. How do we make that useful? And so, it seems pretty simple, right? Just give them the information. But actually, when you look at it as a collection, it's really not. Providing all this information in a meaningful manner is extremely difficult. And so we actually created something called the X-Force Exchange, which you can actually go on there and you can actually take a look at all of this data. It's all cataloged for you. You can find information like DNS information. You probably still think right now I'm selling IBM. I'm actually not. The X-Force Exchange is free. So I'm actually encouraging you to use this. we have, I think it was 700 terabytes of data that we actually put out there in this exchange, specifically so you can monitor it and you can enhance your capabilities on a regular basis. And this is the URL. Everybody capture it. Everybody capture it. We can definitely get that to you later as well. But you can find everything out there from, spam information. You can actually find advisories on major vulnerabilities, and you can actually receive notifications for it. You can receive updates about malware, and you can also look up IP addresses, DNS names, all that fun stuff to get information on some of the things that you guys are looking at in your monitoring environment. So, why is that important? If you look at all of these questions that I know all of us are asking on a daily basis when we look at security, they become very difficult to answer without context. And so a lot of us, join industry groups and to think differently about security. And this is really that core piece, that intelligence piece, being able to integrate that. And if you look at the way that enterprises are mostly doing this today, it's kind of in this model that is, kind of peer-to-peer in nature. It's talking to the right people, knowing the right person, and they give you a little piece of information, you disseminate that to somebody else, and it's sharing in this kind of model, and we call this a mesh network. And if you look at the way that most of the tools that we use for intelligence today work, is that they're primarily a mesh network of tools. These are things like Cybox and using Stix Taxi, or using MISP, if you're familiar with that, which is a malware information sharing platform. It's open source, it's utilized heavily. But what becomes the primary question is that if no one's sharing the information, or they're not sharing all of the information, then who's the data provider in this model? Right? And it becomes very difficult to actually track that and change that. So what we're trying to do with the X-Force Exchange platform is we're trying to change that model to a hub and spoke model, right? Where it's a single source for sharing, collaborating, and getting information for different aspects of intelligence. And this is a little bit of information about that. It systematically creates a broader stroke picture of information. And it makes intelligence more actionable. Right? That's kind of the idea behind it. And that's where you start to pull in a whole lot of other data sources, not just internal data sources, but also external data sources as well. And it creates a more clear picture. And that clear picture is what we kind of call this model with collection, analysis, and integration, where it comes down to action. And it gets brought into a broader security operations model, but you can pull all this together into tools like QRadar, but that is a different story for a different day. And so with that, I will finish up. Presentation finished. Are there any questions? A lot of people think that last portion is a sales portion. It's really not. I'm just talking through the intelligence models and why it's kind of important, and that's kind of the reason why I fly through it. So if you guys had any questions about that, feel free to ask, but I didn't want to beleaguer those points by any means. Sir? So the X-Source vulnerability database has always been free. So has OSVDB. And to be fair, I don't have a ton of information on OSVDB other than a quick conversation with attrition. And so it's just kind of going away. And we've always been really a kind of a more complete database. And if you ever talk to Jericho, he'll even tell you that. But I'm sad to see OSVDB go away because it was a really important aspect. And I don't have too much information on that. Yeah. So between us and then MITRE are the two main ones. But really ours is, it's kind of a commercial thing, and it's a point of pride for us that we've had this since 1997. And if you actually look at vulnerability databases, there's a lot of issues of how do I count this as a vulnerability? It's the same library that's being used in another application. Is it 2 or is it 1? There's a lot of those issues, and I feel as though we have a really good way of answering a lot of those. So yeah, the X-Force database is a great way of looking at that. And you can use Stix and Taxi to actually get a lot of that information as well. I was supposed to tell you to throw curveballs at me, right? And try and
Absolutely.
Who wants to try and make me look stupid next, sir?
So with the difficulty in preventing breaches, is cyber liability insurance a viable option?
So cyber insurance is a utility that is a viable option as a utility. But the reality is that cyber insurance doesn't cover an entire breach. And even to get cyber insurance, you have to be able, in a lot of cases, prove that you're actually trying to prevent issues in the first place. But typically, more often than not, what I've seen with cyber insurance is it's more based on being able to cover the costs of the investigation and the recovery, and not necessarily the impact to the business. And frankly, a lot of that impact of the business is intangible. How much of a price do you put on your brand, right? When people talk about Sony, they talk about breaches, right? Or Target, and that pops into people's minds. How much does that cost? And it's difficult to apply a number to that. So, again, I think it's a viable utility, but I don't think it's the holistic perspective. It's another question. I saw another hand for a split second. I'm going to make you ask a question. No, I'm just.
What do you feel is really the best control right now for handling ransomware? Is it still the layered approach, or is there really one control that's up and coming that really is going to be the silver bullet to help protect ransomware?
Well, so the question was, what's the best control for ransomware? And unfortunately, there's not really a one-to-one matchup for ransomware. And if you're not familiar with what ransomware is, it's essentially a piece of malware that takes over something on your computer or something within your infrastructure, and it demands you pay money before they'll release it to you. So the easiest example is they'll often get on a computer and they'll encrypt all the pictures on the machine, and they'll demand a couple $100 to decrypt the pictures so you can recover them. And unfortunately, again, there's not a singular technology that I can point to that says, okay, this is the ransomware solution. Realistically, what it has to be is it has to be a multi-tiered model that incorporates a number of different capabilities and security, and that's endpoint security, excuse me, network security, application security, and frankly, mobile security. We actually see that a whole lot, where they're actually more and more getting on phones and doing some of these things. So, it is a layered approach in a lot of ways, but it's really more of because it's an expansive, attack methodology, it's really having that comprehensive capability of security end to end throughout your entire environment, unfortunately. So. Sorry, was somebody yelling something at me, or, oh, sir?
So now that IBM has Watson and they're going to add to the things I think I heard that they were going to add to touchscreen. Is there any way of doing deep machine learning to be able to identify various entities that are trying to perform these breaches and be able to, not necessarily like Minority Report, be able to find out who they are first, get law enforcement involved, but closing that gap between time of breach being 6 months down the road before something happens, and then the case that takes another 9 months or whatever. By that time, they're either gone or obviously they don't know who they are.
Right.
But shrink that time down. You're going to say, okay, we know it's this group. They've now breached this, healthcare or financial, that they can get authorities involved sooner to be able to, kind of shrink that breach down so they don't have so much time.
Right. So time to breach and reduce the impact. So the question was, now that we're integrating Watson, which is a cognitive learning solution, machine learning, are we going to be using that to reduce the time to breach and time to impact and the amount of impact to businesses? So a couple of things to explain about Watson. Watson it has to learn, right? It's deep learning, and so it's kind of a baby right now. Now Watson can pass the CISSP, and that's all fine and dandy, but the reality is that it has to take time to learn. So the first step and the first tier for Watson is actually going to be the tier 1 analyst. So the answer to your question is yes, because essentially what Watson is doing is enhancing first the tier 1 analyst to be able to capture these issues as they occur, and not just capture them, but because what you've seen thus far in the kind of like intelligence space with security monitoring is algorithmic artificial intelligence. So if I know I have these 10 things, then yes, alert something. But what Watson is actually doing is it's taking structured external data and unstructured external data and bringing in that wealth of knowledge to be able to better capture those things. And then as it's looking at things, it's actually learning. So once Watson gets to the tier 1 analyst level, yes, you're going to see a reduction in time from the amount of time from a breach to breach detection in some cases, in a lot of cases. And then you're actually going to see Watson continue to learn and move up the curve to get to that tier 2 analyst space. And again, that's going to shrink even further. And then you get on tier 3 and so on. So the answer is yes. But Watson has to learn. It's a baby and it's crawling right now and he's learning to walk. And so we've partnered with a number of different universities like MIT to actually have some of their more advanced students actually training Watson up and teaching it how to catch some of these issues. Sir?
Do you have any idea or projection on the time frame of the rate of progress with Watson?
Yes, I do. It depends. Can you ask my boss when he's going to promote me? Because I can accelerate that curve. I can get you whatever you need, sir. No, I don't have that roadmap or timeline. What I can tell you is that it typically takes Watson about 1,000 hours to learn a new step. And then, so that's with training it. And that you have to add, it's like 10,000 questions so that Watson knows how to answer it. So it's a pretty involved process, but the results of which I think are pretty amazing. And I think you've seen some of those results in healthcare as well as in Jeopardy, obviously. And there's actually a great article right now that's out there on Slashdot called Watson for President. And this is not a person that's affiliated with IBM at all, but he actually feels as though Watson would make a better president making logical decisions than any of the candidates, which I'll, reserve my remarks on that, but you feel free to make your own opinions on that. So, sir. So, I'm sorry, I'm having problems hearing you, but what was the question? How was the, if you're giving me vulnerability information, how am I making sure that the vulnerability is not exposed? Is that the? Oh, so that it's your how am I obfuscating? Okay. Well, I mean, there's a number of things that go into that. Obviously, encrypting the information and then making it anonymous. Are you talking about on the X-Force exchange? Because we can make that anonymous, where it's just you don't want. Yeah.
What do I give you? What can I control that? And you resell that information.
Let's ask the sales guy. Have you resold any? No, we don't resell that information. It's out there, but it's in a lot of ways it's up to you to obfuscate that data, right? If you send, I mean, this is true for anything. If you send up information that says, "Hey, I have a vulnerability. Here's my server logs. Here's my IP address. Here's my organization name," then there's not much I can do with that. So. But essentially what you do is you create what's called collections, and there's a lot of information. I can talk with you afterwards about systematically how to go through about doing that. A health cloud solution? Oh, off the cloud solution? I'm sure we could build something for you. No, we do. We have internal intelligence capabilities that we can help you with for internal sharing. Sorry. I don't know. Do you want to pay for them? No, obviously I don't work in the partnership office, so I didn't set that up. Yeah, as you can tell, because we're not at Michigan State, the greatest university in the world. Who beat Baylor in a bowl 2 years ago. My boss went to Baylor, so I just have to remind him of that all the time. Sir.
Out of all the breaches we talked about in 2015, was any study done to show which ones were successful or started by social media?
You know, that's a key component in a lot of these different breaches, but we don't have that information because it's incredibly difficult to track that, especially post-breach, right? Because it's really easy to go back in logs and be like, hey, look, this just got exploited via SQL injection. It's really hard to go back in logs and go, that guy just gave away the whole thing, you know? One of the earliest and largest credit card breaches, for example, that I ever saw was back in 2003. It was 8 million credit cards, and it was a credit card processor. And what happened was they detected the breach and realized somebody was in their networks and actually cut off everything. They just stopped all services at the firewall and said, don't let anything in while we figure this out. Well, the attacker hadn't actually exfiltrated any of the data yet and got frustrated and called tech support and said, hey, I can't get any access to my stuff. And they actually opened up an SSH connection into the network. And so all 8 million credit cards got stolen after the SSH connection. I mean, it might have been it was SSH connection was opened and all the credit cards went out. And actually, so a little history for you. At the time, the credit card companies wanted $250 per stolen credit card. And obviously the company was like, I'm not giving you that. There's no precedent that says I have to give you $250 per credit card. And that's a lot of the reason why we have PCI data security standards today, is so that they could actually lean back on that. So we don't have those statistics, but I definitely don't want to downplay that because that is a huge aspect in a lot of this. And frankly, with a lot of the things that we put out on social media, we've made it a lot easier to socially engineer people. And we see that all the time in a lot of these attacks, whether it's spam or a phishing attack. But we definitely see that type of information integrated. Sir. So vulnerability information, a lot of that comes from public notifications like disclosures, Microsoft Patch Tuesday. Kind of a unknown thing though is a lot of times when patches are released, they don't actually tell us what the vulnerability is, and it kind of kicks off a good guy and a bad guy race between, you know, researchers like we have on the X-Force reverse engineering patches and figuring out what the vulnerability or bug was, and the bad guys figuring out what the vulnerability or bug was to see if they can exploit it. So we get some from, you know, open source information that's being released, and then some of it comes from our own reverse engineering and research. Cool. Sir.
Is there no research that way your group think that they're going to essentially call in information that's not there?
Absolutely. Yeah. We more or less have an entire team that's basically all they're doing these days. We used to do this primarily with just automated engines, and they would send us reports. But as of late, it's just become so prolific that we actually have to have people focusing on it. Our automation isn't covering everything. So, cool. I'll hand it back to you. Thank you very much.
Everybody, give them a big round of applause.